Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for this debate. And I rise, of course, as the Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Youth Affairs that produced this report with my Vice Chair, the Right Honourable Member for Mansfield, and my former Vice Chair, the Right Honourable Member for Chichester, who I should, of course, note the important role that we took in going up and down the country visiting youth centres in many constituencies that have helped provide the basis of this report. I rise also as someone who worked in my local youth service when I started leaving school at 16. I worked at the National Youth Agency, which of course have helped produce this report, and then 4 years in Brussels at the European Youth Forum. I was a voluntary group leader in my local Woodcraft Folk and their national chair in the Youth Parliament, and I too served on the board of the British Youth Council. You could say that I'm seeped in this area and it flows through my veins. But that doesn't mean that it is an area that I just biasly think is fantastic. And that is why we have tried to base the report on evidence that we have received, over 100 pieces of evidence that came in, and of the visits that we took. But when I joined Parliament and became the chair of the APPG, I was deeply concerned what had happened to those opportunities that I had, those safety nets that we heard from other honourable members, and those spaces that supported us growing up. They had started to wither away. It had been 8 years, it's now 9 years, since Parliament last looked at these issues, and the youth portfolio in government has changed to 3 different departments in that time. And so with the National Youth Agency, we agreed to initiate that report, and we applied, of course, for a backbench business debate for that. I'm rather pleased, actually, that the Minister has stolen our backbench business debate that the Honourable Member for Mansfield and I applied for and was due tomorrow, because I think it shows that the Minister treats this issue with some importance, and the government schedules government time on it. And I hope this is a sign of course, that the Minister will keep her role. I won't, of course, give my total backing to the Minister, because that will probably undermine her if she's wanting a job in the future. But I would say that actually the Minister has shown a real regard for this area that we maybe hadn't seen previously. And that's no particular offence of previous ministers. The portfolio is huge. And I think showing the understanding of youth has been really welcome. And I would also welcome what we've heard today, that 3,000 young people and opportunities in sports will be given, that we will have 500,000 in student bursaries for the apprenticeship programme for 400 students, and that the Youth Charter will come forward, and most importantly, that we will have a review of statutory youth provision and what that means. I want to quickly rattle through some of the key findings of the APPG report, and then I will do some personal reflections on my thoughts of where the sector is. Firstly, the first recommendation of the committee was that there should be a minister responsible for the portfolio focused on young people. Now, as I've said, to be effective, really the Minister needs to be given greater priority for youth work and youth services, and personally I think that the Minister has done that. But currently she is the Minister for Sport and Civil Society and has the responsibility not only for youth but also gambling, horse racing, lotteries and loneliness. And whilst these things are interconnected, the reality is a Minister for Children and Young People focused on that area, and an interconnectedness across government is desperately needed. And that's one of the things that the report, not only our APPG but other APPGs on other areas of that journey of a child, have also pointed out. I'm more than willing to give way.
Again, I congratulate him on his report, and he and I, of course, attended the same school with just a few years in between us. But what he's just suggested, this is number one recommendation, well, actually, what was the case some 7 years ago when the youth brief was within the Department of Education as part of the Children and Families brief, as a result of which we produced the Positive for Youth report in 2011, which was the most comprehensive policy document of proposals on an integrated youth policy involving the statutory sector, the charity sector and the business sector as well. So we are only actually trying to reinvent the wheel here.
Thank you very much. I actually think a lot of this report is about either reinventing the wheel or looking back into the past and seeing the positive things that we can learn from. And always, whilst going forward, we must know our history. I would say historically, the Honourable Member was one of the best children and youth ministers that we've had from the Conservative government in history, in recent history, and I think that he should be very pleased of the work that he did when he was in that ministry, and I think it was a great shame his departure. But that is the past. And the future, we can learn from some of the good things that happened. There also, our report says that there needs to be greater investment in youth work and a commitment to a support of youth services in the next comprehensive spending review. There is no purpose in talking about nice, positive little programmes here and a little grants there that really don't scratch the surface, as we've heard with interventions, unless there is a decent strategic commitment to funding that is part of a long-term government funding review. We call for further research to determine what that benefit cost would need to be to ensure that open access youth services, ensuring appropriate long-term funding is provided. The third point that we made is that government should introduce a clear statutory duty and guidance that defines the minimum protected level service. Now, there is a statutory duty on councils to provide some youth activities, but the guidance on what some youth activities means is so weak you can drive a horse and cart through it currently. It can effectively mean that I can have a local youth football club playing once a week in the local park, and that is it. And so I welcome very much the government's commitment to review that guidance. But we really need to not just have a review on that, there needs to be clear directions that the outcome must be significantly better than we have at the moment. We currently see that youth provision is disappearing across the country due to cuts. But the truth is we don't actually even know the state of all of these cuts because we haven't had an audit of the provision of local authorities since the coalition government. We urgently need now a census or an audit or whatever you wish to call it. And I'm not precious. Previously it was once a year. It could be once every cycle, whatever that cycle is. But we need to know where we stand on a census of youth work, local authority. And until we have it, there is a mantra, of course, unless you measure it, you can't deliver it. And until we measure it and we audit it, we will not be able to assess where we are failing young people. And so, of course, I welcome the Minister's responsibilities, but it must also come with that auditing process. We fourthly recommended that there should be a lead role confirmed in each local authority responsible for the discharge of that statutory duty for youth work. And again, if local councils have a statutory duty, but they do not appoint a person that is responsible for delivering that statutory duty, it is almost impossible to hold that statutory duty to account. Let us remind ourselves, youth work is not a voluntary provision. It is statutorily underpinned, and although poorly defined, local authorities have to show that they are discharging that duty. We recommended that the position should be probably equivalent to a Deputy Director of Children's Services in the local authority responsible, which is upper tier local authorities, and accountable for the duty, ensuring that council officers fully take charge. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the inquiry recommended that the government should develop a youth workforce strategy, including the expectations for the ratio of professional youth workers, trainers and volunteers, there needs to be a standardised national system to evaluate the sufficiency and suitability of youth services and the quality of youth work provisions. This, of course, is where the National Youth Agency comes in. We are currently relying on the NYA to oversee standards, qualifications, access, safeguarding, youth workforce development in the sector. And until last week, they did this without any government funding at all. Now, prior to the coalition government, they had a budget of £10 million to do that every year. Almost overnight, funding disappeared entirely, and they have done a tremendous job in the most difficult of circumstances we've seen. But they've had to limit the services they are able to offer, not only to local councils, but voluntary services, and the only incomes they've had to rely on is private endowments, fees paid to them, and Canada and Australia, which continue to use them for the accreditation of their youth services, paying money into them. It should be, in my view, a national scandal that a national institution designed to keep our young people safe was defunded in such a way, and we've had to rely on the kindness, in effect, of Commonwealth countries to continue funding a service that is offered here in Britain. And whilst I am pleased that the Minister has said that there will be some commitment to the National Youth Agency in some of the workforce reviews, £800,000 is rather too little compared to where we were, and it is definitely too late for those young people that have missed out in opportunities. Now, part of the role was also to provide the audit that I mentioned earlier on for youth services around the country, something that was lost when that funding went. And that needs to be urgently reinstated, and I hope the Minister will either find resources from her department or be able to push for the Treasury to be able to sufficiently fund not only blanket audits, but also the ability to do one-off spot checks. Sometimes you can do these things by just making sure that you pick up where you think that there are problems and delve in. And Ofsted has not, in over 5 years, inspected a youth provision in this country, something they are entitled to do, and I think that actually we could encourage them to do to ensure that the fulfilment is there. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the question of youth work, there can be no question that youth services improve the lives of young people. It offers them experiences outside formal education. Youth work supports, but it doesn't replace formal education, and it enhances the readiness for learning in the classroom and learning in life. That's why professional qualifications for youth workers are so important. My 10-minute rule bill from earlier on last year aimed to put youth work qualifications on a statutory footing. But this, of course, does not devalue the work of some current programmes, such as the apprenticeship programme, which hopefully will come on stream. The government has approved, I would say late, but better late than never, and university programmes such as the fantastic programme at the University of Brighton in my constituency, which ensures that our children and young people are supported by the best qualified people to understand their emotional and educational well-being. Madam Deputy Speaker, we should be under no illusion that the dire state of youth work at the moment. I have been in and out of this sector most of my life. Like any sector, there is politics, with the voluntary sector having arguments with the professional sector, and one point or another, everyone falls out. But what is remarkable now is that the sector, youth workers, voluntary sector, Scouts, Guides, are speaking almost with one voice, that there is a crisis in many of our young people's lives, and we need to step up to be able to support them. And they are campaigning for the survival of much of the sector. Government must be held to account for this. We have multiple youth work programmes that have now closed their doors for new applicants across the country. We have the closure of 763 youth centres across the country. 4,500 youth workers have lost their jobs and the posts have been deleted. And this has led to 140,000 places for young people's access to youth services being lost. This is a sector that is on its knees, and don't take my word for it. Research from the House of Commons Library has shown that funding has gone from 1.2 billion in 2010 to 358 million in 2017. That is a 68% cut in cash terms and almost 1 billion in real terms stripped from the sector. Many parts of this country now have completely no youth services at all provided by the statutory provision. So stark is the bereft felt by young people. 16 to 24-year-olds are now the highest demographic to feel lonely, with 1 in 10 saying they always or often feel lonely, far higher than the over 65s that we often associate with loneliness. And when young people do reach out to help, in my city alone, they can face 12 months to see a professional for their mental health, and it spirals down. And in the very worst cases, we have seen in my city, in only the last few months, young people committing suicide. The government does need to take young people seriously. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it has been the case in all societies that we have had people in the community that support transitions in our lives. We all will go through, at different points, difficult transitions. And historically, since humanity began, that may have been the village elder or the local imam or the local vicar. The role of someone to help that process is vital. And youth workers were there to help that process for young people to transition. And it was quite right, of course, that at the turn of the last century, that we moved away from a link between church and state, and we developed a professionalised programme where safeguarding was embedded and where we made sure that it was built on need, not on what religion you went to. But now what's happened is we've destroyed many of those provisions put into place to replace the role of other areas, and we have not replaced it with anything. We have not replaced it with community endeavour, because the communities are also facing huge other cuts. And that's not to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we see that there is no voluntary provision. I went to Wigan and the on-side centres. We are hoping to get an on-side centre in Brighton. We've got some great ones opening up in London. And we see there qualified youth workers doing good old-fashioned youth work, and it transforms around communities. But they are not perfect, because they are city centre-based provision. And what we need in every community is a voluntary engagement with young people where they have something to do, somewhere to go, and someone to speak to. Because the reality is, parents might be the best to love young people, but actually we need professional engagement to support young people through those difficult moments in their life. So I'm pleased that the government is going to introduce a charter, but will we make sure that every young person has that access of somewhere to go, something to do, someone to speak to? Because if we don't, it can come as no surprise when knife crime increases, when antisocial behaviour increases, when county lines ravage our communities. Because, of course, it's not youth work that will solve these issues on itself. But when you have cuts in social services, cuts in policing, and cuts in youth work, all coming together, what you have is communities bereft of support. And there is a phrase, isn't there, not in a shopkeeper's journal: you break it, you own it. Well, this government, the reality is they broke youth services, they defunded youth services, not councils. They did it, they broke it, they must fix it.
George.